Welcome, and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Assistance, or Ifes, in our webinar series about democratic resilience in Europe during the pandemic. Ifes is a non-profit, non-governmental organization that assists electoral processes broadly defined across the world, and we support elections in Europe since the late 1980s. In this webinar series, we have covered a wide range of topics, starting with the Slovak elections at the very beginning of last year, before the pandemic took hold properly. And then we have discussed election administration and the virus, electoral integrity and disinformation, the active participation of youth, how to ensure that our electoral processes are inclusive for persons with disabilities, enhanced electoral cybersecurity, and last month we talked about disinformation specifically against women active in politics. I'm Magnus, and I'm the Ifes Senior Political Finance Advisor, and I'm also Director of the Ifes Regional Europe Office in the Czech Republic, and we are hosting this webinar. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance, with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices, and is made possible through the generous support of the American people. It has been 1 year now, it feels longer, since the COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. I think that very few of us at the time expected the impact that it would have on our lives, and that it would affect so many different aspects of our societies, including our electoral and political processes. Stakeholders have had to adapt to these new challenges. In this webinar, we will reflect on the challenges and the lessons that we can learn from the democratic resilience in Europe after 1 year of the pandemic. And we will do this by looking at similarities and differences between elections that were held at the very beginning of the pandemic. And we look at the French municipal elections that were held the first round in March last year, with the second round being postponed until June. We look at elections that were held a number of months into the pandemic. And here we have, as an example, the parliamentary elections in Croatia that were held in July last year. And we will look at very recent elections. We have the case of the parliamentary elections in Kosovo that were held only last month. To address and understand the issue of democratic resilience in Europe during this difficult period, we have with us prominent experts on elections in Europe and indeed beyond. First, I want to explore the context of this issue together with the Ifes President and CEO, Anthony Banbury. Anthony is based in the US, but he has worked in various countries throughout Europe, including Croatia and Kosovo. Then Yves Doutriaux will assist in our understanding of the French elections. He is a member of the Council of State in France and a former French ambassador to the OSCE. He will talk both about the elections held last year, the municipal elections, and the pandemic connected to that, and intriguingly also refer to the regional elections that will hopefully be coming up soon in France this year. Ivana Belec is a member of the State Electoral Commission of Croatia, and she will talk about the impact of the pandemic on the elections there, focusing in particular on the importance of civic education and the active participation of youth in electoral processes during this health crisis. And we will explore the impact of the pandemic on the elections in Kosovo with the assistance of Albert Krasniqi, who is Program Director for Democracy Plus in Kosovo. After this, we will open for questions to our panelists, as well as comments. If you have any questions or any comments, you can at any time type those in using the chat function, or sorry, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So let me first turn to the Ifes president and CEO. Tony, it's been 1 year of the pandemic. Among other things, this has had a major impact on elections and political processes. But to be more specific, what in your mind have been the main effects of the pandemic in this area?
Hi, Magnus. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. I am very grateful to my fellow panelists for agreeing to participate in this seminar, and thank also all the participants as well as USAID. The pandemic has obviously impacted every aspect of society and life in our countries. Elections are, of course, not immune to that. There were a number of direct impacts of the pandemic on elections. Of course, many elections were postponed during the course of the past year. Secondly, there were fears about engagement and trust of the electorate regarding the democratic process. The pandemic has undermined trust among people in government overall, and that has also applied in the area of elections. And the issue of trust has a direct impact on issue of voter turnout. And we had seen already a trend toward declining voter turnout, and in some but not all cases, the pandemic has contributed to that trend, and we've seen lower levels of turnout. Third, and this is also unfortunately a societal trend in many places, there has been increased ostracism of marginalized groups. Whenever there is a challenge in society, very quickly marginalized groups pay a price and are targeted either directly and explicitly, or are indirectly victims of these developments. And then lastly, I would say, is the impact or the role that political actors have played in managing the elections in a pandemic. There have had to be a lot of decisions taken to continue with elections or to delay them. In some cases, these decisions have been very well justified and explained to the population and the electorate. Unfortunately, in some cases, though, we've seen political actors use the pandemic for their own political purposes and to try and consolidate power, to try and keep their political opponents from having an opportunity at the polls or in other ways to fairly compete for political power. And also new executive rules that have limited democratic rights. And this is an extremely tricky area for many countries right now.
Okay, so quite a few issues that we need to consider in discussing the impact of the pandemic. And why don't we take each of the four that you mentioned now in turn? Well, first, the basic thing. I mean, how many elections were affected by this? How many elections were postponed? And what has happened to them since? Have they since been held?
This is an issue that Ifes has been tracking very closely since the beginning of the pandemic. And based on our data, as of January of this year, 116 elections worldwide have been postponed. Almost all of those cases occurred in the first half of last year. So the rate of postponement has really dropped. Of those 116 elections, though, 24 have still not been held. And the average delay of the postponement is around 11 months. And as I said a moment ago, in some cases, these delays are for very good reasons and have been explained well to the population. In other cases, though, the delays or the length of the delays have not been so well justified and not been well explained to the population, which further erodes trust among the electorate.
Thank you. Well, you also mentioned the issue of trust. Do you think that the postponement of elections and the discussion around the pandemic and the discussions that we've seen has impacted the voter turnout, first of all, and also the credibility and the trust in the electoral processes?
So the short answer is yes, but it's very hard to determine the exact impact. As I said a moment ago, we've seen trends for reduced participation in elections in many countries. We've also seen a gradual erosion of trust among the people in various government institutions. I think it is pretty clear that the pandemic has exacerbated both those trends, but it's difficult to attribute the precise impact of the pandemic. For instance, though, during 2020 and the beginning of 2021, looking at European countries that held parliamentary or presidential elections, the turnout declined. There were 13 European elections in that time period. The turnout declined in 10 out of those 13 elections, between 1% and 9% compared to the average turnout of the last 3 elections of the same type. But it's hard to say what the turnout would have been had there been no pandemic. We certainly think it impacted it, but it's hard to attribute precisely the impact. Interestingly, though, in 4 recent European elections, the turnout actually increased between 3% and 9%. That's in Georgia, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Poland. There are certainly a variety of factors that play a role in the turnout. Every election's different, every country is different, but the role of the pandemic on voter trust, and in turn voter trust, the impact on election turnout, is really important to examine. I hope this addresses the question.
Sorry, yes, thank you, it does. It's certainly a mixed message and an area for concern. Another thing that you mentioned in the beginning is that, well, we know that across Europe and in other regions as well, people with marginalized gender, sexual, ethnic, religious, and other identities often encounter particular challenges and barriers to voting and to participating in the electoral process in other way. Do you think that the pandemic has had an impact on this issue?
Again, the short answer is yes, it has. And this is a very, very important issue for society and countries around the world. It's very clear that in so many countries, exclusion of groups, national, religious, ethnic, racial, transgender, LGBTQI groups, exclusion of any group is a source of conflict. And when that exclusion is taken to an extreme level and based on other factors, it can lead to military conflict, civil war. We see that in so many countries right now. But even short of civil war, the exclusion of groups from society, from participation in electoral and democratic processes, really undermines the ability of that society to make progress in so many other areas. But we see deliberate efforts by some political leaders in some countries to exclude groups in order to appeal to other groups. And this is a very damaging trend in so many societies, and certainly there have been some autocratic leaders who have used the pandemic to further marginalize at-risk groups. And it's so important to recognize that that marginalization does not just victimize the members of those groups, but really weaken society as a whole. And so this is something that Ifes has been working on extensively with partners in countries around the world before the pandemic. And we've really tried to work on very hard during the pandemic. It's so important for governments and society as a whole to take this issue very seriously.
Thank you. The last point you raised in the beginning is something that's very close to my heart, being working with money in politics and electoral processes. The pandemic is not occurring in a political vacuum. The politicians didn't stop being politicians because the pandemic happened, and we didn't want them to be stopping politicians. My judgment is that many political actors have been very responsible and acted to protect their population during this very difficult health crisis. But there are concerns that the unprecedented volume of funds that have been flowing through the pandemic rescue and vaccination efforts feeds public sector corruption. And also that, as you mentioned, politicians use the pandemic to unduly strengthen their position and to undermine their political opponents. What are the main challenges and indeed solutions regarding public corruption and abuse of state resources?
So this also is a very important issue, and the pandemic has exacerbated the challenges of this to society. When there is stability in a country, when there's no crisis, when elections are taking place regularly without difficulty, the desire, when there's a good rule of law, what otherwise might be the desire of political leaders or populist politicians or corrupt officials to pursue their narrow self-interest are constrained by the laws, the norms, the expectations of society, those well-administered elections. But when there's a crisis, those same groups, those same individuals will seek to exploit that crisis for whatever they're trying to achieve, whether it's political power or personal gain through financial gain through corruption. And there's a high, and in addition, in a crisis, there are emergency measures taken, including very reasonable ones, for instance, for rapid procurement of emergency health supplies, personal protection equipment, and such things. So in that environment, we will see corrupt officials seeking to act for their personal gain. And the constraints that normally exist on their actions, unfortunately, are really weakened. And so there's more opportunity for this. So whether it's corrupt officials trying to abuse the procurement process and put money in their pocket or the pockets of their cronies, political or otherwise, or it's autocratic politicians instituting emergency measures that in one context could be very well justified to respond to the pandemic, but in another context may be done precisely to exclude some groups from participating in the process, delay the elections for their own personal or political benefit. And this is an area where civil society has such an important role and the media has such an important role to really scrutinize why these decisions are being taken. What's the timeline, for instance, for emergency measures? Ifes recognizes the legitimacy of, or at least potential legitimacy of the executive in a government taking emergency measures in response to the pandemic. But the reasons for those measures should be very clearly explained. The length or the duration of them should be only as long as is absolutely necessary. And there should be really good communication with the public and consultation with stakeholders. And it's of course not always the case that the governments will do all that. So the media and civil society has a very important role to play in this context in asking very fair, reasonable questions about the authorities under which these actions are being taken, scrutinizing the procurement actions, and such things. And governments would serve themselves very, very well by acting in an open and transparent manner, by communicating very well with their population, the decisions being taken and the reasons for them. So this is an area where Ifes has been working very closely with our partners in government, electoral management bodies, civil society, and there have been some very good practices we've seen in some countries, but unfortunately, of course, in some, there has been a very poor performance.
Final question. We talked about challenges, we talked about difficulties. You're the Ifes president and CEO. Briefly, what is Ifes doing to help support democratic resilience in Europe during the pandemic, and not least looking at the aftermath of the pandemic?
Well, from the very beginning of the pandemic, Ifes set out as a priority, one of our 3 organizational priorities, understanding the rapidly evolving and unclear needs of our partners on the ground, electoral management bodies, anti-corruption agencies, civil society partners, and adapting our programming to help address those needs. And I have to here thank USAID for being very supportive of a significant change in the programmatic direction that Ifes was headed in many different countries. And so it was very important to consult with our partners, understand, listen, analyze, and then be creative and innovative in adapting our programming so we could really provide the best possible value and impact and benefit for our partners who are facing incredible difficulties. Of course, every organization, every government. And so that was our starting point. And Ifes experts, including, and here, Magnus, I really give tremendous credit to you and the Europe team, have been working very hard to deliver critical analysis and innovative solutions during this challenging time for democracy and elections. Ifes produced a COVID briefing series, 6 different papers on various aspects of the impact of COVID on democracy and elections, and how important actors responsible for upholding democracy and elections in a society could adjust their work to respond to the changing environment. One area of one of these papers focused on conducting elections in a pandemic. And there we work closely with public health officials to develop a series of recommendations for electoral management bodies on how maybe they needed a short period of time for postponement, say 3 months, in order to procure equipment, do additional training, have consultation with stakeholders, etc. But then they were committed to holding the elections, but how to do that in a pandemic. And this is an area where I think Ifes has done well. Ifes has been able to support our electoral management partners who have done an amazing job in carrying out so many elections around the world, and certainly in Europe, in a safe and responsible manner. And electoral management bodies have had to partner in a much closer way with public health officials than they have in the past. There's also, as I've said on many occasions in the past few moments, it's been so important for governments and government bodies to communicate clearly with the public about the decisions they're taking, the rationale, etc. And I know the Ifes Europe team has been very proactive in working on a crisis communications and disinformation playbook that will help our partners in responding to that aspect of the crisis. We haven't even gone into how the pandemic has greatly exacerbated the misinformation environment and how people and entities have sought to exploit that. And so our partners have had to deal with that disinformation environment. And so tools such as the crisis communications and disinformation playbook, I think, have been extremely valuable for our partners. There are many other things that we've been able to do. I won't go into them now in the interest of time, but I will just end by saying how fortunate I think Ifes has been to be able to work in a truly collaborative manner, listening and understanding the changing dynamic and uncertain needs of our partners throughout Europe and Eurasia, and then working with them to adjust programming to try and help them face this incredibly unique set of challenges that the pandemic has placed upon them. And so I look forward to continuing that collaborative work, and I think I speak for everyone on the call that we all look forward to the pandemic easing and eventually ending and going back to, or perhaps going forward to, the collaboration in a more in-person environment. So thanks very much, Magnus. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Anthony Banbury, Ifes President and CEO. If you go to ifes.org, you can read more about the work that Ifes is doing and the resources available. So let's turn then to individual elections that we have held in a European context during the pandemic. And Yves Doutriaux will first help us look at the French elections that we had last year and the current climate with potential elections coming forward. Yves, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. Already been to Tunisia, Georgia, and Armenia with Ifes on electoral litigation. So I know what Ifes is doing remarkably well. I would say a few words about the French municipal elections, the two-round elections, which the first round took place on the eve of the general lockdown of the country. March 15, general lockdown of the country because of the pandemic, March 16. So the first round of municipal election in France took place in more than 35,000 communes, municipalities in France. It's a two-round system. Nicoletta, you can switch directly to number 5. It's a two-round proportional representation. So we have got the first round on March 15. Then on page 6, Nicoletta, you have the results. The totality of the seats were elected on March 15 for more than 30,000 communes, mainly small-sized communes. And for the rest, second round was required. Usually the second round is going to take place the following week, the following Sunday, a week after. But then the government has decided to ask the parliament to stop the electoral process, to suspend it, and to postpone the second round to June. So just before March 15 first round, Nicoletta, you can switch to number 9. The Prime Minister on March 7 sent a circular to the mayors asking them to adapt voting offices to sanitary recommendations, wearing masks, hydroalcoholic solution, you know, all that, in order to ensure a secure organization of the ballots. On March 9, the Minister of Interior sent a circular on proxy vote facilitation for lockdown older voters. Police officer will visit retirement home or private residency to pick up proxy votes delivered by old age voters to other voters, usually a member of their family. But in spite of all this, for the first round, we have got more than very high, 55% of abstention, which is very, very high, 56% of abstention rate at the first round of the municipal election. And you can have a look on page 10, with an opinion poll just before the first round of the municipal election. Nearly 40% of the electorate explained that they would prefer to abstain because they were afraid of the virus, 40%. So on page 11, you will get information about the general lockdown on March 16 and the decision of the government to ask to the parliament to postpone the second round. But at the same time, and that's very peculiar, the government and the parliament decided that those who have been elected on the first round, their election will not be affected by the postponement of the second round when a second round is required. Later on, the Constitutional Council judged that this law, postponing the second round, shall not be interpreted as meaning that it's not possible to bring a litigation, an electoral litigation, to administrative justice. But the delay for claiming, the usual delay for claiming, is 5 days after the proclamation of the results of the election. And we have decided by law that such a delay, because of the pandemic and the lockdown, will be postponed to 5 days after the election of the mayor, meaning in May, not 5 days after the outcome of the first round, but 5 days after the election of the mayor later in May, in order to make possible access to the electoral judge for all the voters and the candidates, non-elected or elected candidates. Then page 12, Nicoletta, the Council of States, my body. As you may know, the Council of States is a legal advisor of the government, and at the same time, it's the electoral judge on appeal from the Administrative Justice First Resort Tribunal. So that on March 2020, the Council of State gave its advice on the law postponing the second round. We state that there is no precedent in French political history in postponing a second round right in the middle of an electoral process with 2 rounds. And according to the Council of States, there is no constitutional or legislative provision that would prohibit to do so through a law adopted by the Parliament. The Constitutional Council has to check in such a case, which is unique, no precedent, if a sufficient general interest can justify elective mandate prorogation. Because if you postpone the second round, that means that the incumbents are going to stay in office for a longer time than the electors decided. They were at the beginning elected for 6 years, not for 6 years and 3 months or 4 months or 5 months. So constitutional requirements regarding electoral sincerity and vote sincerity are based upon the principle of equality of votes, one man, one woman, one elector, one vote, ballot sincerity, meaning no fraud, and time limitation of electoral mandates, which means that electorate voters have to give their say on, from time to time, every 6 years in the case of municipal election. So it would be only admissible, according to the Council of State, to interrupt an electoral process and to postpone a second round after a first round has taken place, only if there are imperious general interest in exceptional cases, and only if such postponement will not go beyond a reasonable delay, taking into account the circumstances which justify it. Next photo, Nicoletta. And we set up an analysis grid. First, the second round postponement is justified by exceptional circumstances like the pandemic. It's very exceptional, no precedent, at least during modern time, and urgent necessary measures for efficiently fighting against public health dangers. Second, the lockdown, prohibition of public gathering, and interpersonal contact limitations are regarded as imperious motives, making impossible normal electoral campaign. No more public meetings between candidates and voters and so on and so forth. Postponements must be strictly time limited, as the second round was already scheduled within 3 months in June. It took place on June 28th. And governments will report to the Parliament on May 10 for the latest on scientific assessment of the pandemic trends and its risk. And in case, so we said that in March 2020, in case where it would be impossible in June to organize the second round, then the government and the Parliament would have to resume the whole process back to square one, meaning that the first round would be annulled. Next number, perhaps 15, the next one, you have the figures for abstention. As Tony has just said, there is an erosion of trust over the long run, as you can see, between 2001 and 2015, with a growing rate of turnout. But here you have the last two rectangular, you have the first one, then the second one. First one, 55% abstention, and second one, June 2020, 59% abstention. There is no precedent of that. So next photo, please. Here you have the proceeding for electoral litigation proceeding. You have to go after 5 days, as I said already, to the electoral administrative judge. Next photo, please. And if you have irregularities, it doesn't mean that the electoral judge will annul the votes. It has to be to affect the sincerity of the votes. Next photo, please. Who can cast a petition? Any voters and any candidate, elected or non-elected. Next photo, please. And you have 5 days to go to the judge to put your litigation, your claim against an election. And next photo, please. Question: would high abstention rates would affect vote sincerity? In principle, the abstention rate is not supposed to affect the ballot outcome if it has not affected its sincerity. Vote is not compulsory in France, contrary to Belgium or Luxembourg. Next photo. Here you have the map of France, where you can see that more than 500 mayors among the 35,000 have been elected with an abstention rate above 70%, including in big cities like Tourcoing in the north of France. Next photo. We can imagine cases where pandemic could have affected vote sincerity. Imagine a commune seriously affected by a pandemic cluster, a candidate that would manipulate the election in exaggerating publicly the risk of the pandemic, or sanitary measures that would have affected the organization of the ballot, closing of electoral offices, too long voter lines because of social distance. But then the claimants would have to explain the reason why the pandemic would have specifically affected one list of candidates versus another one. So next photo, please. You have the case of a litigation case in a small city in Normandy, where there was an abstention rate of nearly 56%, and the Council of State has decided that against the background of such abstention, that abstention rate cannot be regarded as having affected the sincerity of the ballot, because there was such a huge gap between the two main contenders. The first list got 70% of the suffrage, the other one just 30%. So that such a gap has not affected, give evidence of lack of sincerity of the vote in spite of the abstention rate. And the last photo, please. Here it's about the regional elections coming in June, already postponed. It was supposed to take place in March, postponed in June. And because of the third wave of the pandemic, there are speculations of another postponement, having in mind that we have the presidential elections in March 22. And some political parties are already worried of possible executive manipulation in order to have the regional election postponed after presidential election, as there is a risk for Mr. Macron to get very bad regional outcome of this upcoming election. And then it has been said that in the US, at the peak of the pandemic, they were able to have their presidential election last November. And in Germany, 3 weeks ago, regional election in two very important lenders took place without any problem apparently. Why? France should postpone its upcoming regional election. I think it will not be postponed thanks to vaccination and thanks to the coming back of good weather in summertime. I will stop here because of time limit, ready to answer any question and looking forward to statement from Kosovo and Croatia. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Yves. I think we will all follow French politics and elections with great interest this year and as well as next, and we'll see what happens both for the regional and the presidential elections. And we will take questions and comments after our panelists have all had a chance to discuss with us. And I want to move now to Ivana Belec, who is a member of the State Electoral Commission of Croatia. Ivana, well, the entire idea of elections is based on the participation of the people, not at least young people. Can you tell us a bit of what the State Electoral Commission of Croatia has done to increase the participation of the electorate, not least of the youth?
Thank you, Magnus, for your question. Well, youth civic participation is always an interesting topic to discuss. How young people can participate in civic life and how they can be encouraged to do so more are challenges for any society. Civic participation encompasses a wide range of formal and informal activities with the same intention: to protect public values or to make changes in society. By participating, young people can contribute to their community's welfare by inspiring and sharing new ideas. Young people may therefore be involved in many different ways, such as volunteers, political party members, social activists, or voters. In this short representation, I will try to briefly explain how our State Electoral Commission approaches the young voters, especially in this challenging time of this pandemic. The State Electoral Commission of the Republic of Croatia is a permanent and independent state organ, and besides its primary role to conduct elections, the Commission conducts other activities prescribed by law. The Commission's activity of informing and educating voters is considered essential for raising public awareness and fairness and transparency of the election.
Ivana, sorry, a quick question. So obviously elections is a lot about choice. Is voting compulsory in Croatia?
Well, it is important to mention that voting is not obligatory in Croatia, and there are no restrictions for voters who don't cast a ballot. Therefore, it's even more important to inspire the voters to exercise their civil right to vote. But how? We would mostly be informing voters on their voting rights, the current elections and elections in general, and the regular Commission activities through our website or public media. When it comes to approach young voters, Commission has outlined our education as crucial. Back in 2018, we started a project called My Vote Counts Too. The project was aimed at high school graduates who are about to turn 18 and become so-called first-time voters. According to Croatian law, no pre-election registration is needed, so all voters turning 18 are automatically enlisted in the voters register, and all they have to do is vote. The purpose of the project was to introduce these first-time voters to basic electoral terms, electoral process, and voting process so they can learn how to participate in the elections actively, as voters, as candidates, as members of the election committees, and as observers.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more then about how this project by the State Electoral Commission was conducted?
Well, the State Electoral Commission members visited more than 20 high schools of different educational directions throughout Croatia and lectured more than 1,000 high school graduates. Within their school curriculum, these students learn in general about political systems, constitution, civil rights and duties, legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the state. Our lectures provided them detailed insights into the elections, especially those conducted throughout the year 2019, presidential elections and European Parliament elections. By educating them on how to vote and how to participate in the electoral process, we try to emphasize their participation in the elections and why is it essential to exercise their voting right. To make the lectures more interesting for the students, we introduce them to some authentic electoral materials, for example, ballot box, ballot papers, and voter list. We also staged a polling station in the classroom, and students acted as voters, members of the election committees, and observers. It was a fun way of showing them how voting on the election day looks like. We intended to conduct this project in as many schools as possible, but then in March 2020, everything stopped due to a well-known reason, the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, this pandemic is still pending throughout the world and makes us face different challenges in our everyday life. It affected young people's lives tremendously. Classrooms and hanging with friends are replaced now by screens, voice applications, and digital platforms. It affected us as an electoral body too. The elections must be conducted under strict epidemiological measures. Polling stations and voters adequately equipped with masks and other safeguard items. Hereby, it is important to state that voters in Croatia may only vote in person on polling stations. There is no voting via the internet or post. That makes election preparation and conduction during pandemic even more challenging. Besides pandemic, our country was recently faced with numerous earthquakes, some of which were devastating. In some cities, all the existing polling stations are ruined and need to be transferred to other locations in the upcoming local elections. Still, the State Electoral Commission finds young voters' education necessary. Therefore, we proceeded with our project by adjusting it to the epidemiological situation in Croatia. At this moment, we are educating high school graduates on the upcoming local election. How? Online, of course. The Commission filmed a webinar and published it on its website. The webinar content follows the formal lecture content. It provides students information on elections held in Croatia, basic electoral terms, electoral participants and procedure, as well as the importance of executive voting rights. We informed all high schools in Croatia of the published webinar, so professors could present it on the students. They can also arrange an online class with the Commission representative via Zoom. As here you can see my colleague Slaven just during the online webinar. Since February this year, we have held several online educations attended by more than 150 students. Students may check their knowledge in a quiz. So, Nicoletta, yes, it's okay, thank you. And fill a related survey published on our website at the end of the webinar or online education. We found this survey result beneficial while giving us feedback from students whether they have any interest on the election at all. As we are no longer able to communicate with students in person and stage a polling station in their classroom, in the webinar and during online educations, we use animation to explain the whole voting process on the polling station instead. As I mentioned earlier, there is no voting via the internet and the post in Croatia. Therefore, the students were introduced to epidemiological measures on the E-Day on the polling stations, wearing masks, maintain distance, use disinfectants, carrying their own pens. What did the young voters education teach us? Students show interest in elections. Before the election starts, around 50% of students confirm they will vote, while when the lecture ends, more than 80% of them confirm the same.
Ivana, I'm interested. You're saying that students show an interest in elections, but when you did these discussions, what did they find the most interesting to hear about?
Well, they found it most interesting hearing actual situations that we experienced in the elections, such as those when one vote mattered and changed the course of the whole election. For example, when on local elections in one municipality, both candidates for the local mayor got the same number of votes in the second round of elections. The third round had to be held. Or when on European Parliament elections, one candidate list won no mandates due to the lack of only 2003 votes. Currently, survey results show us that most students intend to vote in the upcoming local elections. We are glad that they found our education useful, but we are excited even more than after attending our education. Most students think that their vote counts. At the end of this presentation, I would once more like to emphasize that even in this challenging time, we need to proceed with education young voters. They need to be aware that almost all governmental issues affect them, such as education, healthcare, or foreign policy. They also need to be aware that they exercise their right to participate in the crucial democratic process by participating in elections. They vote for the leader who should adequately represent them, consider their ideas and support their interests. By educating young voters, we should increase their awareness and encourage them to participate in any kind of civic engagement. Thank you, Magnus.
Thank you very much, Ivana, for talking to us about the important work that the State Electoral Commission of Croatia is doing to increase civic education and the participation, especially of young people. Right, we turn then to a very recent election, and we turn to the issue of Kosovo. Talking to Albert Krasniqi from Democracy Plus, Albert, Yves mentioned, and he talked about the issue of the legal basis for postponing elections. I understand that there were discussions and concerns regarding this particular issue in Kosovo. Could you talk to us about that?
Thank you, Magnus. Thank you for this opportunity to share my reflections about Kosovo elections. During the period of 1 year after the declaration of the pandemic by the World Health Organization, Kosovo had organized 2 elections, one parliamentary elections last month, and also local elections in one municipality of Podujeva, but they were already been scheduled when the COVID-19 was declared pandemic. But after the registration of the very first positive case with COVID-19 in Kosovo, the next day the elections were postponed by the president through a decree. The postponement took place 1 day prior to the elections, when all the preparations were made from also political parties and the Central Election Commission. The recommendation for postponing the election was given by the institution of public health. It was the time when most of the countries were no longer governed by the political parties, by health experts. The main challenge in this case was the lack of the legal basis of postponing the elections after they already have been scheduled. As a result, one of the political parties considered that elections are being postponed for the benefit of some other political parties. Therefore, they had filed a complaint at the Constitutional Court alleging that President Doutriaux at that time had committed a constitutional violation. The resignation of the President Doutriaux later, before the end of his term, made it impossible for the court to decide on that case. However, the elections were held in November, at a time when 70 new cases per day of COVID-19 were registered in Kosovo. And we postponed the elections when we had only 1 case in the entire country. The organization of elections in the municipality in the time of the pandemic was an opportunity for the institutions for the organization of elections and those for the protection of public health to use it as a pilot project for the organization of the parliamentary elections nationwide, which were held on 14th of February 2021.
Albert, one issue we haven't discussed that much in this webinar is the impact of the pandemic on election campaigns. Can you tell us a bit more about how that worked in the elections in Kosovo?
Terribly wrong, in the sense that after a long battle between the assembly and the government, finally the law on combating the spread of the pandemic was adopted in August last year. The members of the parliament from different political parties were boosted that they had adopted a law through which they would have an impact on the reduction of COVID-19 cases in Kosovo. Among the measures provided was that a ban on the public gathering, which had to be dispersed by law enforcement agencies as soon as they were notified for their organization. However, these bodies did not have the courage to stop holding of activities of political parties. They organized massive campaign rallies with a gathering of 1,000 people. And they went to the places where rallies were already over and in selective way imposed some findings on political parties. Ironically, at this case, political parties in those public rallies promised the rule of law in the fight against the spread of the pandemic. And they openly violated the law, which they had approved a couple of months before, and directly endangering the lives and health of the citizens for just a couple of votes. The number of positive cases with COVID-19 was increased significantly after the end of the election campaign.
And after the end of the election campaign was the election.
Yeah.
What was the impact of the pandemic then for voters and also for election observers, another area we haven't touched on much?
Yeah, thank you, Magnus, for that question. Kosovo, in fact, is among the countries that allows out-of-country voting. We have a large diaspora living out of country, and for them to vote, they must apply initially, and then once they have accepted, they should send the ballot paper by mail, which must arrive in Kosovo a day prior to the election day. In parliamentary elections, interest in voting from abroad was the highest in Kosovo election history. Over 100,000 citizens had successfully applied. However, not all were able to exercise their right to vote, as this was hampered as a result of the pandemic. The reduction of airlines companies and the banning on flights from some countries that had a large number of cases made the ballots to send by mail to not arrive in time in order to be counted. Many voters used express mail services, those from private companies, which had an additional financial cost on them. Some published their bills of around €100 to send a single ballot on time. According to some unofficial statistics, the cost for voting from abroad was around €5 million, which is equivalent to the amount we have spent to organize the elections within a country for general populations. Also, others had some travel bans, and they have traveled in person, but they faced barriers because they need to have to prove the testing negative for COVID, and also to self-isolate for 14 days when they returns to their homes. Another impact of COVID-19 was to the persons who were positive at the time when elections were held. The Central Election Commission had adopted a guideline regarding the measures taken on election days in order to prevent the spread of the virus. Mainly, these were common measures such as keeping the distance between voters, using masks, disinfecting hands, and also ventilation of polling station every 2 hours for 30 minutes. At the time, it was quite cold in a country, and those measures were not successfully or fully respected according to elections observers. However, the CEC made useful of in order to guarantee the right to vote for those voters who were affected by COVID-19. The CEC contacted all those infected at the time who were on the register of health institutions and asked them if they were interested in voting on election day. They have organized mobile teams and visited them in order to vote, and also in their mobile teams there were also a doctor just in case they need any kind of assistance. Also, there were constraints regarding the elections observation. Kosovo elections in Kosovo have traditionally aroused a great interest of local and international organization observers. In the past elections, domestic organizations were present at each polling station. Due to the pandemic situation, for the first time in Kosovo, no international election observation mission was present, and also domestic observers halved the number of the observers by around 70%. The absence of observers in a polling station had also increased electoral irregularities. In some of the Serb majority municipalities, turnout was up to 85%, or twice as high as the national average turnout. When the preliminary results were published, it was realized that there were irregularities in these municipalities. A diversion scheme was implemented among the voters of the Serb community in order to vote for some satellite political parties that were pretending to represent the interests of other non-majority communities who hold 10 guaranteed seats in the assembly for minorities. The votes received from those political parties were annulled by the Supreme Court last month.
Thank you, Albert. Final question. What was the impact of the pandemic on the outcome of the results? Another issue we haven't discussed very much. And in general terms, what are the lessons we can learn from the holding of elections in Kosovo during the pandemic?
Yeah, I can give you an example of one of the oldest political parties in Kosovo, which is LDK, and they have formed after the abolition of the autonomy within Yugoslavia by the Milosevic regime. Traditionally, older generation had voted and been associated with this political party, mostly because of its past. The other political parties who were founded after the end of the 1999 war in Kosovo were more attractive for younger generation because of the spirit they have represented and being more radical in a sense of solving all of our problems. But the organization of elections in the time of the pandemic was to the disadvantage of the LDK. They could not count on their most loyal voters, the oldest voters, who were more reluctant to go to the polls on election day, to stay in crowds with other people, as they were more at risk as an age group to become infected with the virus. Maybe this is not the only reason, but in these elections, LDK has registered the weakest election result in its history. But nonetheless, within a year of the announcement of the COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned, 2 elections were held in Kosovo. And despite all the challenges faced by the institutions for organization of elections and the health ones, Kosovo proved that it can organize elections in the midst of the pandemic without compromising the democratic functioning of its institutions. Also, as Tony mentioned in the beginning, we had, despite of that, we had an increase in the number of voter turnout, which was the largest compared to the previous elections. And also, it was quite cold at that day, and people also showed to the election polls and voted in the time of the pandemic. Thank you very much, Magnus, and the other participants for their attention.
Thank you very much, Albert. And of course, we should never underestimate the impact of the weather on turnout and participation in elections. Well, thank you so much to all our panelists. We are now turning to the question and answer portion of our webinar. And I have received a number of questions that I want to pose to either to individual panelists or to all of you. For all our participants, if you have more questions, comments, please type them in using the Q&A function. I will not be able to ask all of these questions, unfortunately. We do apologize for that. Starting with a question to the Tony, the Ifes president and CEO. The question is, you mentioned in the beginning that while many elections were postponed in the beginning, most of them were held later. So this person is interested in Europe. Were there more? How does the 2020 as an electoral year compare to other countries? Were there more elections? Were there fewer? How does that stand?
It's interesting. In fact, the past year, last year saw a record number of elections in the ENE region. A total of 14 were conducted. As you well know, Magnus, Ifes colleagues working in the Europe team were incredibly busy during this pandemic period. Worldwide, but especially in the Europe and Eurasia region, and it was a record 14 elections conducted, many of which we, of course, supported, worked with our partners on.
Thank you, Tony. And yes, I think that is the case. I think it's also the case that 2021 happens to be unusually quiet comparatively in terms of elections held in European countries. I mean, this is always, of course, staggered to how the electoral cycle in different countries. So I guess, fortunately, we have fewer elections scheduled for this year. Okay, I have one question specifically to Yves Doutriaux. The person is asking, do you think it's likely that France will introduce postal voting as a way to protect risk groups from infection in relation to voting?
Yes, I've seen that question. There is a debate on this, but I think it was 2-3 months ago. But then it has been seen as a potential manipulation by those who were proposing that, and I think it was one member of the government. So after the big debate in the States with Mr. Trump regarding postal voting, I think it has been considered that it would be wiser not to change the rules, at least during a short period of time, a 1-year period of time before any ballot. So now it's too late if we wish to change the rules for the presidential election because there should take place in March 2022. So we will not change the rules. We have adapted the proxy votes. I forgot to tell you that between the first round and the second round, in order to facilitate turnout, to facilitate participation, it has been decided that each voter can get 2 proxy votes and not only 1. That was a way to take care of age, because when Tony spoke about ostracism and marginalized groups, one should have a specific attention to the old people because they were particularly afraid because of the virus, whereas the young people, unwisely, by the way, consider that they can, resist to the virus. We know that now it's not the case, but a year ago, it was clear that with a chronic illness, old people, high weight, obesity, all these people were considered to be weaker to the virus, and so that they could be specifically ostracized regarding their voting rights. Reason why specific measures have been taken for them for the second round. And perhaps we should change on a permanent basis our rules, because our society is getting older and older, in order to facilitate the access to the votes, not to speak on a technical disposition for the voting office, for those who are on chair and so on. Specific size of the electoral booth when you hide yourself for the secrecy of the votes. So if you are on a wheeling chair, you need at least perhaps 2 square meters and not only 1 square meters, and so on and so forth. So beside the pandemic, perhaps one should reconsider some of our voting rules in order to facilitate access to ill people, sick people, and other categories of the people. That's a connection with what Tony said about ostracization. And by the way, there is another issue, and we spoke about that on Croatia with Ivana, young people. There is right now a debate in France. Do we have to authorize voting rights for those below 18, between 16 and 18? Big debate. Some would say, oh no, certainly not. They would vote for the extreme, particularly extreme right. I don't know why. Others would say, if you change voting age, then you have to change penal age, because when you are a voter, it means that you are responsible, including in front of the penal criminal judge. So you see, it's a big issue. So I think it's wiser to postpone it after presidential election. I think Ifes would share the principle that one should not change the rules during the year before the ballots. So too late for changing, and including for the postal vote.
Thank you very much, Yves. And yes, you are pointing to, we use as a general rule of thumb, 1 year ahead or out from an election. We don't really want to see a legislative change because of the time it takes to implement these things. Thank you very much for that answer. It brings to mind a few installments ago on this webinar, we talked about cyber issues. And one of our panelists in that webinar was talking specifically about internet voting as a related issue, alternative ways to voting other than going to the polling station. Her point, I think, was very important, that while internet voting may be a valuable approach, it's something that has to be considered carefully. It takes time. It's not something that should be introduced as a rushed measure. I just want to stress that. We have a question for Ivana Belec. The person here says that, I understand that the turnout in the parliamentary elections last year were low. Indeed, I think this person says that they were the lowest since Croatia became independent. What are your thoughts about this? To what extent do you think that this was connected to the pandemic?
I'm not sure that it has to do anything with, but I mean, I'm certain in some percent it has to do with pandemic. But you know, in Croatia, it's almost always lower percent. It's not so high percent of voters that are going out and vote, and that's why I think this youth civic participation is also very important. Also, that I stressed. Learn them that they have to vote, they have to go out, and that they have to decide for themselves, not stay at home at the E-Day, but go out and take your chance to take your opportunity to say with your vote, how do you how would you like to be your country in 4 years ahead. So I'm not sure, am I a right person to say, is there some connect with COVID, and should we postpone or should we not? I think not, because we didn't see or notice any connection with increasing number of illness after the voting, and I think it was the right decision to hold that elections. Now we have some information in media. As is there any problem? Are we going to postpone these local elections in May? And now I can say surely that we are not going to postpone them. And I think we will have good percent of that who will vote.
Thank you very much, Ivana. I want to make a point. One of my colleagues has noted that later today, Ifes will release an update to its Safeguarding Health and Elections paper. That's based on the very latest public health information regarding the pandemic. So this evening, possibly tomorrow, if we are in Europe, go to ifes.org and look at the update of the Safeguarding Health and Elections paper. I have received a lot of questions. There is one that I think will serve extremely well for us to round up this webinar as we are moving towards the end. Basically, the person is asking, and this is for all of our panelists, and I want to ask Albert to take a first stab at this. What would you say are the main lessons that we can learn about the pandemic in terms of resilience democracy in Europe overall? Albert, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you for your question. I think it has, the pandemic situation, it has pushed every one of us who are dealing with elections to think beyond what we have traditionally think about elections, and also to try to find other ways of elections, of voting without endangering the life of citizens. We might face or have similar challenges even in the future. Who might know? Hope not. But postal voting was one of the methods which might be used in order to have the distance between the people and not to endanger their life and their health. So this is something which I think all of the countries need to invest and think for alternative ways and to ensure voting by this method. US was a good example of that, and they had the highest voter turnout, people voting by mail. So this is something which might be used to not to to endanger even the democratic functioning of the institutions. Another thing is also the legal basis for postponing the elections in order to have a clear infrastructure, legal infrastructure, how someone might postpone the elections without using it for their own advantages. We have solved similar cases all over the world, but they need to be institutionalized and also regulated by legal basis when someone can postpone elections, and how are the rules that should be implemented and fulfilled. And also the competencies of those institutions, government or local government, if they are working in this kind of postponement, if they are going to have all the competencies, all the power they had when they are elected, or there are some should be limited or not.
Thank you very much, Albert. Anthony Banbury, Ifes President and CEO, what's your take?
First of all, it's been great listening to my fellow panelists, and I really want to thank again all of them, Yves, Albert, and Ivana. It's been so interesting. The pandemic crisis, like other crises, tend to reveal weaknesses in systems, and I think we've seen during the past year or so both weaknesses and strengths and resilience in the face of revealed weaknesses. We know that that authoritarians, corrupt people will seek to gain advantage wherever they can, and we've seen that in a number of countries. At the same time, we have seen, very importantly, population, electorate, civil society acting in ways to seek to preserve their democracy. And no country, no democracy is perfect. In the United States, the elections in November of last year revealed some serious challenges and some efforts to constrain people's access to voting. But then there's a counter reaction to where people are fighting even harder to preserve that democratic right. And it's so important for all stakeholders, electoral management bodies, civil society, youth. I really appreciate the remarks of Ivana about youth, of Yves about the elderly, the issues around risks of exclusion that we talked about before are so important for society. And wherever one lands on the political spectrum, the principle that people must be able to vote, even in a crisis, even in a pandemic, is so important. And the administration of elections is so complex and can be manipulated and subject to exploitation that there is a critical role for technical experts, and I hope that it's fair to count Ifes among them, to provide advice on all aspects of election administration. But the system won't work without an engaged electorate, and people in any country cannot take election and election administration for granted. So I try and look at the experience of the last year in an optimistic way and see the resilience of democracies around the world, even in the face of tremendous difficulties and challenges and efforts to undermine it. And the lessons that we can take away from this crisis, which will be, in many cases at least, transferable to the next crisis, whatever that is, should be drawn and analyzed and applied in a very contextual way. Issues around postal voting may be highly appropriate and effective in one context, but inappropriate in another. the important issue is to draw the lessons and continue to seek to improve the administrative, regulatory, normative framework for elections. And Ifes is certainly committed to working with our partners toward that end. But again, the role of civil society, media, the electorate is so important.
Thank you very much, Tony. Ivana, briefly, what do you see as the main lessons that we can learn?
Yes, I agree with Tony that not only youth civic participation is the main topic, also the elderly. And I must stress that we are really taking a great effort to take mobile teams on the E-Day for those elderly too, so they have chance to take their vote. We have to go on under these measures. We have to do the best to provide to everyone to have the right to vote.
Thank you very much, Ivana. Perfect answer. And I'll give the final word to Yves Doutriaux. What can we learn?
As I agree with what Tony and Ivana and Bert said. As Churchill said, the democracy, the representative democracy, is the worst system in the world, as we know. But I believe, as Albert, in participative democracy, but participative democracy will not replace representative democracy and elections, obviously. Lessons learned, as Ivana said, we have to adapt. For instance, just now for the regional election, as the electoral campaign is obviously affected, one should find ways to support political parties to organize electoral campaign without meetings. So one party asks for more public financing for mailing propaganda to each voters. So speaking about internet voting, we have had experience of that, but we have been forced to cancel it because of hacking and foreigners interaction, very east of Paris. So that, I don't know if it's east or west, but not the States, but after Pacific. So that, given the technique, we prefer not to use internet now for political election. We use every day for professional elections, trade union elections, and so on. So we have to adapt. We are able to be resilient, but we have to update even in a short period of time. What I said about 1 year before, that doesn't mean that additional budgets should not be decided by the government for facilitating the mailing of written propaganda to voters, for instance, for the next regional election. I thank you very much for Ifes. I've been very happy to participate, and thank you to the other speakers. I know now more about Kosovo and Croatia and the elections there. Thank you. And
thank you very much,
for your invitation.
Thank you, Yves. We have come to the end of this webinar. I want to thank all our panelists for their excellent contributions. I want to thank all of you for participating. I wish to also thank USAID for their support to this event, and indeed my Ifes colleagues for the preparation and management. The next installment in this webinar series will be held on April 28 and will focus on abuse of state resources in relation to electoral processes in Europe. Until then, thank you all again, and I wish that you will all stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.